Devil's Advocate! Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Devil's Advocate. We're here today with Metronal Network member, Wade Tisthammer. Did I say that right?
Oh, I'm trying to build up my brand name. I have two brand names I'm trying to build up. One is Maverick Christian. The other one is Wade A. Tisthammer. That's what I'm planning to get published on because it just looks cool. Wade A. Tisthammer.
It does look cool. Although Wade Tisthammer is pretty cool in and of itself. Anything with the word hammer in it actually flies.
Yeah, Thor would think so.
Yeah, I have a friend whose last name is Thorkild, and Thorkild is Danish for Thor's hammer. Now, does it get cooler than that?
It's pretty cool. It's Norse, so yeah, it's got to be cool.
Right. What's a tist?
Something really cool, I'm sure.
Yeah. And Tist's hammer is, yeah. Let's skip past the last name and go on. Wade here is part of the Mentionable Network, but he works on his own time and he's got his own ministry going on, and he's an intellectual, and he's come up with an argument that tonight and devastate. Sorry. But let's hear the argument first.
All right. So here we go. All right. Moral argument against atheism. So here's the general structure. If atheism is true, then nothing is morally wrong. Some things are morally wrong, like torturing infants just for fun. Therefore, atheism is false. Now, I should define my terms here. Moral semantics is about how we define our moral terminology. Moral obligations have an ought component to them, like an action is morally wrong for someone only if they ought not to do it. What type of ought are we using here? So some oughts are descriptive. We can call it descriptive ought as that type of ought that is reducible to something purely descriptive. So example would be when if you want to do well in school, you ought to study just means something like as a matter of practical necessity, you need to study to do well in school. Whereas what we can call a prescriptive ought is not a descriptive ought. It prescribes in a way that is not purely descriptive. So for example, someone saying you should not torture infants just for fun might have that sort of ought in mind. So the moral ought, at least on common moral semantics, is a prescriptive ought. It is false that the moral ought has no properties besides purely descriptive ones. For example, an action is morally obligatory for someone only if they prescriptively ought not to do it. Now, as a warning, some atheists have moral semantics where moral oughts are purely descriptive. It may sound strange, but it does happen sometimes. An important side effect of this is that moral properties of prescriptive oughtness, like moral wrongness, are non-natural, and as they're not part of the natural physical world. So that's largely because natural facts, like facts that can be stated entirely in the language of physics, chemistry, and so forth, are descriptive. I can go more detail on that, but if you want like symbolic logic and math, can demonstrate fairly rigorously that this sort of moral semantics leads to moral properties being non-natural in my blog, which is linked to a scholarly paper. Now, the general approach for this argument here is that to justify a premise, one, I'll argue that morality's existence is unlikely if atheism is true. Now, that is due to a nice theorem of mathematics and propositional logic. It's a theorem that given A, probably C entails probably if A, then C. So that's what it looks like for symbolic logic and math, for the math and logic nerds out there. So morality is unlikely on atheism entails probably if atheism is true, then morality does not exist. Now, if you want more details on that theorem, you can check out my blog here. Now, to support morality being unlikely on atheism, I'll aim to show these two things. One, given atheism, we have no good reason to believe morality exists. And two, given atheism, moral wrongness is clear in a way to make it prima facie unlikely. So prima facie unlikely basically means unlikely in the absence of any good reason to believe the contrary. So yeah, 1 + 2 equals, given atheism, moral wrongness probably doesn't exist. So one important thing about moral properties is that they are empirically undetectable. To illustrate what I mean by this, imagine a moral nihilist who doesn't believe in morality, and moral realist who does believe in morality observes some jerk kicking a dog just for fun. The dog whimpers in pain and runs away. Now, both agree on all the same physiological and psychological facts, that the dog felt pain and suffered minor injury. Now, the moral nihilist says, I don't think moral wrongness is attached to that action. The moral realist says, I think moral wrongness is attached to that action. There is no empirical way to determine who is right here. Both views, moral nihilism and moral realism, are empirically identical. They agree on all the same empirically observable facts. So if morality is empirically undetectable, how do we know about it? Now, warrant is that ingredient added to true belief that yields knowledge. For example, the warrant for belief might be some type of evidence or justification for that belief. It's a common philosophy term. Now, moral wrongness is empirically undetectable. In practice, we rely on moral intuition to believe that moral wrongness exists. It just immediately seems true to us that it's morally wrong to torture infants just for fun, for example. But how does intuition deliver warrant for morality? Well, on theism, it's pretty easy. God, an objectively moral, good, and omniscient being, designed our cognitive faculties in such that when functioning properly, they intuitively apprehend morality's existence. But in atheism, well, moral wrongness is non-natural and causally inert. There's no God to give us these intuitions. And barring the supernatural, our brains would give us the same intuitions of morality existence, regardless of whether morality existed, because, as I said, morality is causally inert. And anything non-natural, outside the natural, causally interacting with the natural would by definition be supernatural. Now, this would seem to undercut such moral intuition from properly justifying our belief in morality, if we knew that we'd have this intuition regardless of whether morality existed. On atheism, it seems like we wouldn't have any good reason to believe that morality exists. I could go into this in more detail, but for sake of time, I'll skip it for the nonce at least. But I think you can get a general idea of why on atheism we don't have any good reason to believe that morality exists. So that's step one. How about step two? Morality is queer in a way to make it prima facie unlikely given atheism. Well, given the existence of God, a non-natural, objectively morally good being, morality's existence is not queer. After all, God is himself morally good, which entails morality's existence. But in atheism, however, morality is queer in a way to be prima facie unlikely. To give an illustration of the general idea here, consider the idea that an invisible unicorn is floating above my head. Now, this claim is possible but not plausible. We would be justified in disbelieving in this unicorn. This unicorn is queer in a way to be prima facie implausible, and we are prima facie justified to disbelieve it. Moral oughtness likewise seems queer given atheism. Given atheism, moral properties are queer because, morality is invisible, non-physical, empirically undetectable. It seems like we need something like supernatural clairvoyance to know it exists. Remember, it's non-natural and causally inert. Queerness is arguably akin to an invisible and non-physical deity. So that's the roughly oversimplified overview here. There's another way to look at it, an unbiased atheist illustration that I've used before. So say that an unbiased atheist is an atheist who hasn't heard about morality's existence and doesn't have any intuitions for or against morality's existence. She will instead evaluate how likely morality's existence is given the data and atheism. So as an outsider test, I think she serves as a good vantage point for evaluating how likely morality is given atheism. So let's consider what the atheist knows. She knows there is zero empirical evidence for morality. She knows we have no good reason to believe in morality. Objective moral properties are suspiciously queer, akin to invisible and non-physical gods. Again, non-natural. Evolution occasionally gives false beliefs, like gods. People would have the same moral beliefs even if morality did not exist, barring supernatural intervention. And so it seems to me the unbiased atheist would be justified in thinking that, like intuitions of God's existing, intuitions from morality are probably delusory and not veridical. So it seems that when you look at it from the perspective of this unbiased atheist, it does seem that given atheism, it is unlikely that moral wrongness exists. And recall that given atheism, moral wrongness probably doesn't exist, justifies the first premise to that theorem of mathematics and propositional logic I mentioned earlier. Now, it's an interesting thing about this is that suppose someone denies that some things are morally wrong. An atheist denied this. Well, if an atheist believes denies that some things are morally wrong, well, then they at least implicitly agree that given atheism, moral wrongness probably doesn't exist, in which case they have to agree that the first premise is true. So one interesting result of this is that an atheist can't really deny both premises of this argument, because when an atheist denies premise 2, they have to acknowledge premise 1. And that will be it for now.
Okay, so for the listener, devil's advocate is me grilling the other person on the line. The kinds of questions I ask and the kinds of approach I take don't necessarily reflect my own personal views. I'm being skeptical. I'm playing the skeptic in order to give Wade here the opportunity to kind of break down his argument against possible skeptical questions. So I'm serving as an interlocutor. You know what word I mean.
Interlocutor, I think is how I pronounce it.
Thank you. Thank you. So yeah, now that I've said that, turn to kind of grill Wade. Now, Wade said a lot of things very quickly, which may have been difficult to absorb in the period of time that he put them out there. So the questions I have may force him to kind of break these down and describe them a little more slowly, let's say. All right, so having said that, Wade, it seems like your entire premise kind of begs the question. You begin with this idea of morality as you see it, and then you kind of impose that upon the atheist worldview.
I'm a little bit unclear begging the question. Which premise begs the question?
The idea that if atheism is true, nothing is morally wrong. Aren't you begging the question of morality in that point?
I don't assume.
That's your first premise.
Well, premise 2 is the one that asserts that moral wrongness exists. So, I mean, if you're like questioning that premise, I could just like basically point to a good example. It's like, all right, how do we know that anything's morally wrong? Like, well, torturing infants just for fun. That seems to be something that's morally wrong. And so there, we have an example of something that's morally wrong. So by the rule of logic known as existential instantiation, we have something that's morally wrong. Now, an atheist could bite the bullet here. They could say, well, I don't think anything is morally wrong, not even torturing infants just for fun. The atheist, but then the atheist would have to accept the first premise. They'd have to accept the first premise of the argument. And that leads into an interesting dilemma for the atheist, because, you know, what's more reasonable? You know, atheism, or that there's something wrong with torturing infants just for fun. Now, some atheists are more willing to believe that there's nothing morally wrong with torturing an infant just for fun than they are willing to believe that atheism is false. But by my lights, that's a level of irrationality akin to religious fanaticism.
Okay, so isn't intuition though? All you're doing is giving an example of something I find unpleasant and taking from that there must be some content to my unpleasantness, the feeling that associates with that imagery.
Well, I'm not inferring that because it's unpleasant, therefore it's wrong. I'm just doing something more immediate. Here's an example of something that's wrong. It may be also the case that it's unpleasant, but that's beside the point. That's not the reasoning involved. That's just pointing to an example of something that's unethical.
Okay, so if we were to come to a disagreement, let's say that I believed that raising your children and teaching them about God and in the church and so forth is arguably brainwashing and morally wrong because you're not allowing them to mature and make decisions based on evidence. You're kind of enforcing evidence-less faith upon them and so forth. I'm not making that argument, make that assertion. We've come to a disagreement about what's right and wrong. I intuitively come to the conclusion that that is wrong. That's a moral wrong. So how will we determine, given our disagreement, which intuitive idea is the right one?
Well, a good analogy for this is think of how people look at the same data and have differing intuitive perceptions about where the evidence points. How do you resolve agreements? Well, in some cases, you might not be able to resolve disagreements. In some cases, maybe you could, and you could do so by appealing to agreed upon facts, agreed upon rules of logic, agreed upon rules of inference. And then maybe you could come to an agreement, but maybe you can't. Maybe just people have differing intuitive perceptions about where the evidence points. And that can hold true with morality as well.
It seems to me that your entire case dangles on this intuitive idea that some things are actually wrong.
Yeah.
You're aware that there are atheists that have come to the conclusion that there are in fact no rights and wrongs. And is there any logical contradiction in coming to that conclusion?
I don't know of anything self-contradictory about it. I think it's moral nihilism. While I don't think it's a reasonable belief, I don't think it's a reasonable belief that there's nothing wrong with torturing an infant. I don't think it's not self-contradictory. I don't think it's self-contradictory, but a lot of crazy ideas are non-self-contradictory, but they're still not reasonable belief. Like, I could be a brain in a vat. There's nothing self-contradictory about that. Well, that's true, but it's not really is that more reasonable to believe than the reality of the external world? I don't really think that it is. The same applies with morality. We have no more reason to discount our moral experience than we do to doubt our intuition that the external world is real.
So how would you approach a moral nihilist if you were to try to convince them of your argument?
Well, honestly, I probably could. I could maybe like point to examples and hope for the best. Like, don't you think there's anything wrong with torturing an infant? You might say no. Well, how about a homophobic bigot torturing a lesbian because of her sexual orientation? That's like, they might say no. Okay, well, as a Christian, I believe that homophobic bigot is wrong in torturing a lesbian for sexual orientation, but you don't think that homophobic bigot is doing anything wrong at all? And they're like, yeah, all right, well, agree to disagree.
Okay, so again, ultimately ends up being an appeal to intuition. Can you take from that intuition the fact that we have a shared moral intuition, that as a society, we can come to an agreement on particular laws that we allow politicians and police forces and so forth to enforce? Is there any argument to be made by this shared moral intuition that there might in fact be moral facts?
Well, really we're just is appealing to agreed upon experience. Like, for example, start with science, for example. We agree that the external world is real. Do we try to argue somebody to think that, yes, the external world is, well, no, it's just something that we kind of agree on. I should perhaps point out that we're getting a little bit farther from the scope of the argument.
Sure. All right. Well, the scope of the argument begins with premise 2 that some things are morally wrong, and that's basically the point that I'm challenging in the idea that there's some appeal to intuition here. But anyway,
yeah, I kind of go at that point, though. It basically goes to a standstill where some atheists are willing to accept anything at all if it means they can stick to atheism, including whether it's wrong to torture an infant just for fun. I mean, if I had learned that my religion taught there was nothing wrong with torturing an infant just for fun, it's like, okay, that religion's false. No, move on. Yeah. But, some religious beliefs, and to be fair to atheists, there are some religious people who are similarly irrational. There are some religious fanatics that say, oh, yeah, it's right to kill all these innocent people for my political cause. Like, no, it's not. But yeah, this sort of thing does happen among religious and irreligious alike.
So, again, your argument sort of rests upon the idea that there is some transcendent ontological foundation for morality. But couldn't morality...
One of the things relies on. There are two premises of the argument.
All right. So if there was some other way to determine morality from a, say, a social contract theory or some kind of psychosocial process, wouldn't your argument fall flat?
Well, what does social contract give us? Well, it can give us, like, we agree on rules for behavior. Great, but there's still this non-natural, invisible moral realm out there. And it seems that given atheism, it's unlikely that this non-natural moral realm exists. And if that's true, then the first premise is true, whether one likes it or not, regardless of whether you can develop a social contract or not. So,
wasn't your argument intended to prove that there is the non-natural unphysical realm?
No, not exactly. It's supposed to show that atheism is false. The conclusion of the argument is that atheism is false. So the first premise is that if atheism is true, nothing is morally wrong. The justification for that premise is that if we assume for sake of argument that atheism is true, it leads to moral wrongness probably not existing, which entails that the first premise is probably true. The second premise is that some things are morally wrong, like torturing an infant just for fun. And from the first two premises, it entails that atheism is false.
Okay, so but I believe I heard you say that your argument isn't an appeal to the transcendent.
I'm not sure what you mean by appeal to transcendent. I mean, morality is transcendent in the sense that it's non-natural. At least morality is how I define it, will be non-natural. Because I define the moral obligations such that they prescribe in a way that is not truly descriptive.
So let's say abstract instead of transcendent. Would you?
Well, I didn't say
agree?
they're abstract either. That could lead to moral. That could be interpreted to be moral Platonism, but non-natural, that covers it all. It's at least not part of the natural physical world. These properties are non-natural.
Okay, so there is no word you would use to describe things that exist outside of the natural universe, except for non-natural. That's what I'm saying. That's the only word you choose to use. Why is that?
Because it covers anything that's not natural, so it's very unassuming.
Okay. All right. So, yeah, you're not. Would your argument allow for other non-natural things like logic and reason and beauty and things like that, or are we only concerned with morality?
Well, this argument is agnostic about whether logic or beauty are natural or non-natural. It doesn't take a position either way on that.
Okay, so your argument seems to be sticking purely to the non-naturalness moral law. How does that allow for God if it's the only non-natural thing you're willing to concede?
This argument doesn't say that morality is the only non-natural thing. It's agnostic about that. So both premises, well, neither premise makes that assumption. So really, the magic of logic is such that in a logically valid argument like the one I presented, the only way it can fail to be sound is with a false premise. Now, if both premises are justifiably true, the conclusion follows, whether you like it or not, whether the argument talks about other non-natural things or not.
Okay, so the argument is that atheism is false, not that theism is true. Presumably, the falseness of atheism implies the trueness of theism, right?
That would seem to follow.
Okay, what's the definition of atheism that you're using here then?
I'm defining it as view that there is no God.
Okay, the view that there is no God, which leads me to believe that your argument is an argument to God, to the existence of God, correct?
You could think of it like that. I mean, strictly speaking, this argument is consistent with polytheism. I just used atheism because it simplifies things. I mean, there's another way I could have done it. Is like if God doesn't exist, then nothing is. God doesn't exist, then nothing is morally wrong. In which case, like even though I'm not an atheist, I think atheism has enough going for it, such that if I found out there were no personal supreme being, I'd be an atheist. But yeah, this was just basically done to simplify matters.
Okay. So you're saying that atheism is false. You're not willing to say that theism is true, though. And you're not really arguing to God necessarily.
Well, I mean, if atheism is false, then it would follow that it has to be some sort of deity, I suppose.
Okay. Which leads me to believe that you are allowing by this argument for something non-natural that is separate in some sense from moral law.
It could be, yeah. So this argument doesn't like take a position about how morality exists exactly, well, apart from the fact, of course, that it's non-natural.
Yeah, but it's against atheism. Buddhism is a form of atheism. They don't believe in a God, but they do believe in a transcendence of sorts. They believe in some sort of universal spirit, that your soul, once you die, kind of merges with the universe and then is then reincarnated to somebody else. So there is a belief in the transcendent in some sense in Buddhism, but there's no belief in God. So wouldn't your argument be consistent with Buddhism?
Well, I mean, Buddhism is a non-theistic religion. So the conclusion is that atheism is false. I mean, I suppose you could be a Buddhist and believe in God theoretically, but Buddhism, as far as I know, Buddhism doesn't make any claims to any deities.
No, Buddhism is an atheistic religion.
Right. You could. All right. Let's assume arguendo that Buddhism is an atheistic religion. In that case, it would follow that Buddhism is false from this argument. You could say, I'm a Buddhist. Yeah, you could say, I'm a Buddhist. I believe in something transcendent.
Certain moral laws.
Well, yeah, they can believe it if they want to, but then they're going to have to still attack a premise. So which premise would they attack?
I would say that they'd probably attack the idea that if there is moral law, then atheism is false.
All right. Well, I sort of presented an argument for that. Given the two component for the justification of the first premise is that on atheism we don't have any good reason to believe that morality exists, and that has partly to do. Huh?
I would say on naturalism, because your argument is for something that is non-natural, and it's possible to be a naturalist. No, it's not possible to be a naturalist and believe in the transcendence, but it is possible to be an atheist and believe in the transcendence, like maybe the Akashic records, for instance, or a form of Buddhism where there's this world spirit type of thing, which is not a god per se, and therefore they can assert that there is no god and still allow, say, for a Platonic universe. So a Platonic universe would allow for abstracts like moral law without necessarily appealing to a god. It seems like your argument is for it asserts that naturalism would be untrue if they're moral law.
Well, that is true. Atheism. I mean, you could. The problem is for the atheist is that the atheist. I mean, what is an atheist going to do here? Because the atheist could posit something like we humans have supernatural powers of clairvoyance detecting these moral properties. That's not inconsistent with atheism, right? It's possible. Yes, it's possible, but it's not very probable. It does seem pretty far-fetched. Given atheism, it's far more likely that we don't actually have warrant from relative existence. It seems far-fetched that we have these supernatural powers detecting these moral properties. You can assume it, but it doesn't seem very likely.
Okay. Now, you're aware that there are atheist arguments that ground morality in other things that are natural.
I'm not sure. That wouldn't work with this particular type, because remember how I define morality is where moral obligations prescribe in a way that is not purely descriptive. This sort of morality is going to be non-natural. You won't be able to ground it entirely in anything natural. Now, if you define morality to be so that moral obligations were hypothetical oughts, that is the oughts of hypothetical imperatives. So an example would be of a hypothetical imperative. Kind of an example I gave earlier, like if you want to do well in school, you ought to study, just means something like as a matter of practical necessity, you need to study to do well in school. That's a hypothetical imperative does. It describes what to do as a practical necessity to achieve some goal. Now, if that's your moral semantics, such that moral obligations are entirely descriptive, then you could ground it in some sort of purely natural thing. But that's not really an option with the type of morality that I defined, and where that type of ought that prescribes the way that's not purely descriptive. That's the sort of ought that most people have in mind when using morality, and that sort of morality is going to be non-natural. You won't be able to ground it in anything natural.
Well, again, your argument appears to appeal to intuition, and couldn't I ground my moral intuition in something else? For instance, evolutionary history, or my history of reinforcement through culture, or even my parents telling me that, I'll be punished if I get this, I'll be rewarded if I do that. And then that extends to society at large. As you mentioned in school, I am rewarded for, participating in the schooling, and I'm punished for not participating in the schooling. And so as time goes on through this history of reinforcement and punishment, I develop moral intuition based on my history of reinforcement.
So that at best explains patterns of behavior, and those are descriptive. It doesn't do anything to explain that non-natural moral realm. It might help explain why you believe in it, but like I mentioned before, that's not going to get you warrant. That's not going to get you moral knowledge. At best, that's going to give you true belief. And when you think about it, it's like, well, I'd have these intuitions of this non-natural realm existing, regardless of whether it existed. That seems to undercut that intuition as a source of warrant from reality's existence.
Well, couldn't I determine oughtness from a sort of veil of ignorance approach?
I mean, you could come to a belief in morality, but wouldn't be warranted because, like I said, you'd have these same intuitions. Well, perhaps this illustration will help. Imagine a cyborg has an implant in his brain, and this implant is designed to deliver the intuition that a widget contains metal, if and only if the widget contains metal in its inner hand. But now suppose this implant malfunctions so that it delivers the intuition that it contains metal, regardless of whether it contains metal. Now suppose this widget is in her hand. She says, this widget contains metal because that's what my implant tells me. Now that she would have a belief that it contains metal, but it wouldn't be knowledge because her implant is malfunctioned. It delivers the intuition that contains metal, regardless of whether it contains metal. So her belief would be true, but it lack warrant. And that's the same position that we would have if atheism is true. We'd have this intuition regardless of whether it existed. Well, then how do we know it exists? It doesn't seem like we have any good reason to believe it.
Okay, so let's review your argument a bit. Your first premise is that if atheism is true, nothing is morally wrong. Could I swap the word atheism with naturalism and still be justified in this argument?
Well, the conclusion would have to be different. It would have to be that naturalism is false. I mean, if we were to make it logically valid.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, if you change...
atheism you defined as the belief that there is no God. Naturalism would just be the belief that there is nothing besides the material, matter and energy.
Sort of. It's the idea that the supernatural doesn't exist.
Okay. So would you make any kind of distinction for the purposes of your argument, or are they interchangeable?
Well, atheism and naturalism aren't the same thing. So they're kind of close. And they're close. One relative way they're close is that basically anything supernatural the atheist might appeal to is far-fetched to be considered like have negligible probability. That's like, well, I'm an atheist. I could believe in supernatural powers of clairvoyance. Like, yeah, but do you really believe it? I don't believe it. Do you? It's like, well, no, that seems really unlikely. So, I mean, for almost all practical purposes, naturalism is true because any relevant supernatural intervention, like supernatural powers of clairvoyance, is just too far-fetched, given our background knowledge anyway.
All right. And then you said some things are morally wrong, and you determine moral wrongness and rightness. You don't use an appeal to intuition, or you do?
Well, what I do is I just point to an example of something that's morally wrong. So if you point to examples of stuff that's morally wrong, then it would follow that there are some things that are morally wrong. So, I mean, in practice, I think we do rely on intuition. It just seems true to us. For example, that torturing innocent sentient life just for fun is morally wrong. But strictly speaking, I don't necessarily appeal to it. Point to examples.
Right. Okay. Now, of course, this is a syllogism, and it's logically valid, so the conclusion follows from the premise. So there's nothing I can object to. So I suppose that would end the my questioning of you. Do you want to kind of sum up and kind of rehash your argument for the purposes of the audience?
All right, sure. Premise 1, if atheism is true, nothing is morally wrong. Premise 2, some things are morally wrong, like torturing infants just for fun. Conclusion, therefore, atheism is false. The justification for the first premise is that given atheism, it is unlikely that morality exists, which entails the first premise is at least probably true. Justification for that consists of 2 parts. Given atheism, we don't have any good reason to believe that morality exists. Premise 2, given atheism, non-natural moral wrongness is queer in a way to make it unlikely given atheism. I'll
interrupt you here. Can you define the word queer in this case?
So queer means strange.
Okay, so you're using it synonymous for unusual.
Yeah, so it's in this context, it's like wildly different from the types of things we know exist in a way to make their existence unlikely. So the example I gave was an invisible unicorn floating above my head. Okay. It's possible but not plausible, and it's queer in a way to make it prima facie unlikely. That is unlikely in the absence of any further evidence. And non-natural moral wrongness is queer in that way on atheism.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
No, please conclude.
Okay. So yeah, those 2 points mean that. Okay, so to recap, those first 2 points: given atheism, we don't have a good reason to believe that morality exists. Given atheism, we do have some reason to believe that morality's existence is unlikely, namely queer in a way to make it prima facie unlikely. And so the first premise is true, and second premise is true. Something's normally wrong. Conclusion, therefore, atheism is false. That follows from the two premises inescapably. And if you want to attack the argument, remember that the argument is logically valid. So the only way it can be felt to be sound is if a premise is false. And if you don't have an objection that attacks the truth or justification of any premise in the argument, it might be red herring, because if the premises are justifiably true, the conclusion follows inescapably, regardless of what else might be true, such as the magic of logic.
Okay, so that's the end there. Caleb, did we have any response from viewers? No, I don't see any live comments. Caleb, did you want to jump back in on this at all?
Your mic's off. You're muted.
Yeah.
Yeah, I should remember to do that. Yeah. Y'all hit it at about 80 miles an hour the whole way and ripped right through that thing. I don't really have much to add. Now you're muted, Joe.
Joe, you're muted.
It's like a disease going
You
around
wanted
here.
to, yeah, hypocrisy of me. You wanted to follow this up with something else, Caleb. Are we pretty much good for devil's advocate?
I think so. I think we got a solid segment. So, yeah.
Okay.
I will go ahead and take us out then.
Okay.